Hey there, Ryan Reynolds here. It's a new year, and you know what that means. No, not the diet. Resolutions. A way for us all to try and do a little bit better than we did last year. And my resolution, unlike big wireless, is to not be a raging and raise the price of wireless on you every chance I get. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment required, equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes on unlimited. See mintmobile.com for details.
Today on CityCast Pittsburgh, it is official. President Joe Biden has blocked the sale of U.S. Steel to Nippon Steel. And now both of those companies are suing the federal government and someone else. This is big international news and big news for our city and our region because it is not clear now what's going to happen to one of Pittsburgh's oldest and most identifiable companies. Today, I am with CityCast executive producer Mallory Falk to explain how we got here and what might happen next. It's Tuesday, January 7th. I'm Megan Harris, and here's what Pittsburgh's talking about. Mallory, hi. Hello. We are starting off the year with some pretty big news.
Very big news.
On Friday, Biden officially blocked the sale of U.S. Steel to Nippon Steel. They're a Japanese company. And now it's not clear, we're just not sure what's going to happen to U.S. Steel, the one headquartered here in Pittsburgh, and whether this company that's literally tied to our entire identity as the Steel City is actually going to even stay here in Pittsburgh.
Yeah. And I mean, none of this is surprising. We knew this was coming. We have actually been talking about this on our show for more than a year, which is wild. But, basically, since December 2023, Biden had been promising to block the deal. So he really just did what he was saying he was going to do all along. But for any new listeners out there, people who missed the news headed into the weekend, we figured we would just give you a rundown of the whole saga and also talk about what's next, because this is such a major story in Pittsburgh right now.
Yeah. So let's talk about the sale itself and what was on the table kind of going into this past week. So over a year ago, Nippon offered big money to acquire U.S. Steel. Now, Nippon is headquartered in Japan. U.S. Steel, of course, headquartered here. We have the famous steel tower, and their facilities are all over the region. But those facilities, they need a lot of work. And U.S. Steel has been saying for a long time that they cannot afford to do that. Also, these facilities pollute a lot. A lot of the air pollution in our region has been coming, especially from Clairton Coke Works. Mm-hmm. And they've been saying, we can't afford to deal with that either, not entirely on our own.
Yeah, and that is where the money part comes in. So back in December 2023, Nippon offered over $14 billion in cash for U.S. Steel and all of its assets.
And note here, actually, U.S. Steel had been shopping the company around all that year. They had offers from Cleveland Cliffs in Ohio. They are a rival of U.S. Steel's, and Esmark here in Pittsburgh, but nothing even close to $14 billion. U.S. Steel shareholders were very, very happy. They approved the Nippon deal in April of 2024.
But on the flip side, the Steelworkers Union hated it, or at least union leadership did. They said they were blindsided by U.S. Steel management. They hadn't been warned about this kind of deal. They actually backed the deal with Cleveland Cliffs and wanted to see Cleveland Cliffs step in and take over. Mm-hmm. So for all of last year, all of 2024, the Steelworkers Union maintained that they were skeptical that Nippon would really honor the union's contracts, protect worker pensions, and kind of keep things running the way they would want this company to be run.
Yeah. But I mean, Nippon over the course of this year also made a lot of promises trying to get the deal locked down. They do have an existing relationship with the U.S. Steel workers through a different company. But the offer also jumped up, the money part, from $14 to nearly $15 billion. That included some dedicated funds to clean up some of these U.S. Steel facilities, like the blast furnaces at the Mon Valley Works. That's in Clairton, Braddock, West Mifflin, and Fairless Hills. They did promise to honor those existing bargaining agreements. They said they would keep current employees on through at least 2035. I imagine that probably would have been subject to some kind of renegotiation at some point in the future, but we never got that far. And they said they wanted to create a workforce training center here in Western Pennsylvania. And then just last week, as part of this big last push to try to get support, Nippon said that for the next 10 years, they wouldn't make any cuts to production capacity without first getting approval from the U.S. government.
Yeah, so they were essentially offering to give the government veto power over any cuts, at least for the next decade.
Yeah, which to me at least signals we're not going to decline and maybe we're going to try to grow.
Yeah. So while all of this is happening, there is this federal committee. It's called the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, or CFIUS, much easier to say. Its members had to review the deal for possible risks to national security. So to me, at least through this whole process, it seemed kind of vague what those threats might be.
Same.
Yeah, back in September, Reuters reported that they'd seen this letter CFIUS sent to both of the steel companies, both U.S. Steel and Nippon, voicing some concerns that, when U.S. Steel was making trading decisions, if it was owned by Nippon, it might be influenced by Nippon's commercial interests, instead of putting its own first. And also there were concerns that Nippon could make decisions that would, quote, lead to a reduction in domestic steel production capacity. Maybe that's part of why Nippon decided in this kind of last-ditch effort to give the U.S. government veto power over reducing that capacity.
But, it just kind of seems like the government has taken a kind of we don't need to tell you, it's a need-to-know only stance on what national security risks actually mean, which, our nation has a long history of going back to well before 9/11.
True, but also, this is important for the future of how foreign companies negotiate with the U.S. So there's an argument to be made for some transparency here. But anyway, the members of this committee, they couldn't ultimately even reach a consensus on whether this deal posed a security risk. Their final report, they, didn't have a clear recommendation. They just kicked the decision to Biden, who, like we said, had already promised to reject it. And so then on Friday, he did.
Yeah. CFIUS released its report on December 23rd, a little early Christmas present to all the journalists who had clocked out for the day. And then
for
Biden
the holiday
I know, right? And then Biden had 15 days to officially make a decision. So technically today actually was the deadline, but Biden went ahead and blocked the deal on Friday.
So that was the broad overview. But even if you weren't trying to tune into the story while it was happening, you might have heard about it just by tuning into a Steelers game or the radio or YouTube. This was talked about everywhere.
Yeah. U.S. Steel executives, I have no idea what they must have paid for some of these commercials. They and Nippon went on a really widespread public campaign last year to try and sway people, union members, power brokers, probably regular Pittsburghers, to be talking about this in a way that, was much more positive, that this is some big, great idea for the city and for the company.
Yeah. And full disclosure, they even coordinated an ad with us back in August.
Yeah. And some might say that their big campaign worked for some people. Union leadership, of course, strongly and consistently opposed the deal. So did some lawmakers like Biden, of course. But Senators Bob Casey and John Fetterman were against it. Our incoming Senator Dave McCormick, he didn't like it either. A few members of Congress weighed in. But a bunch of rank and file union members said that the deal might be the best way to keep the company financially sound. Some of our think tanks here in town, some of our nonprofit leaders, they were much more, I will say, if not neutral, leaning towards the deal, and that this was really important to keep U.S. Steel headquartered in Pittsburgh over the long haul. I thought the one that really struck me was this little faction of Mon Valley mayors. They made their own commercial sort of to double tap the U.S. Steel one. I definitely included the Braddock mayor. I kept seeing this thing run, but they're sitting around a table and talking about how, they were skeptical at first, but they came around because they are really worried that if this deal is blocked, that U.S. Steel might close these plants in their communities altogether, which would decimate them. I can't imagine they could continue and try to thrive without a big plant like this.
Yeah. And some of those mayors also said something that changed their mind was Nippon's promises to try to help clean up the mills and reduce pollution. I know the mayor of Clairton, which, Megan, you noted, that mill in particular contributes so much pollution. Mm-hmm. The mayor of Clairton was one of those speaking out in support of this deal.
Yeah. And I mean, even as recently as like September, a few hundred union members rallied downtown in support of the sale. It was a really visible, I thought, display of support that, at least at that point, by the fall, like kind of felt like a big change from what I had been seeing from the United Steelworkers Union, like the leadership, the statements that they had been putting out. But to me, like that's the big question as we step back from this is, U.S. Steel promised around the same time in the fall to permanently close operations here in town, or maybe just move the headquarters of the company, like if this deal doesn't go through. And to me, that like it just felt like such a powerful like play, like almost like a toddler looking at you and being like, you will play by my rules that I'm making up on the fly, or I will take my toys and then go home. Like it just felt so dangerous to hear that in the news while this deal is still being like reviewed by CFIUS and the federal government.
Yeah, I mean, you're essentially kind of tacking a threat onto this deal, which I know made a lot of people feel uneasy.
I don't even know how they would move, though. Like, these plants are enormous. Like, I understand why they said it, but it also strikes me as like the kind of thing that is really hard to execute in real time.
Yeah. And I mean, at this point, it's not even clear if that's still their plan. And if it is, like how quickly they might be able to do this. But, right after this deal was blocked, both U.S. Steel and Nippon Steel, they said in a joint statement they would be pursuing any and all legal avenues to fight D.C. Nippon had already accused the White House of having a, quote, impermissible influence in the CFIUS review process. So they were already kind of primed to take action if this got blocked.
Yeah. And I mean, and now there are 2 lawsuits in play. So on Monday, yesterday, Nippon and U.S. Steel filed suit in D.C., alleging that this was a political decision and violated both companies' due process. They also filed here in Pittsburgh against Cleveland Cliffs and the head of the United Steelworkers Union, accusing them of, quote, engaging in a coordinated series of anti-competitive and racketeering activities to block the deal. So I am going to be fascinated to see how both of those play through the courts.
Yeah, that is something we are definitely going to be watching. But, the New York Times actually pointed out that technically these 2 companies could also sue each other now.
I know. It's wild, right?
Yes, because there was this clause in their agreement that said Nippon would pay U.S. Steel $565 million even if the deal was blocked. But like right now, at least, it seems like these 2 companies, they're in lockstep. They're trying to figure this out together and keep this going together. But of course, we will be watching every development.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. The new year brings new health goals and wealth goals. Protecting your identity is an important step. LifeLock monitors millions of data points per second. If your identity is stolen, LifeLock's restoration specialist will fix it, guaranteed or your money back. Resolve to make identity health and wealth part of your New Year's goals with LifeLock. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
While we're actually on the subject, let's read just a quick snippet of Biden's actual statement. It's long. It's on official White House letterhead. But he says that it's his, quote, solemn responsibility as president to ensure that now and long into the future, America has a strong domestically owned and operated steel industry that can continue to power our national sources of strength at home and abroad. He says he was fulfilling that responsibility by blocking, quote, foreign ownership of this, quote, vital American company, end quote.
Interestingly, in that statement, he mentions these national security concerns, but doesn't spell them out. So it continues to remain pretty vague. He did not address what they were when he officially blocked the deal.
Yeah. And I also just love this like whole vital American company thing. Like in any other context, I feel like U.S. Steel would love it that the, president of the United States is calling them vital. But, if he's doing it while in a statement about blocking a deal that they were really pushing for, I'm sure it's not welcome information.
Yeah, very good point. I mean, I have seen critics say that they think the opposition to this deal was less about national security and more about the optics of selling a company named U.S. anything.
Yeah, I mean, I saw one mill worker quoted Friday who said that exact same thing. Like, quote, if we were named anything but U.S. Steel, this deal would have been approved months ago, end quote. And I think like that to me is like the greatest summation of so much of this whole conversation.
True. I mean, I also think like in the lead up to the election, you have the union, you have all of these workers saying they oppose the deal. And so it became a real political issue too,
But you had leadership saying that they opposed the deal. And to me, that's the difference. Like, we don't hear from rank and file members unless leadership chooses to let us. And it wasn't until that rally downtown, at least for me in September, that suddenly it became much more clear that rank and file members don't actually agree with leadership. And then you see the mayors speaking on their own behalf. They don't agree with union leadership. They're pushing for this deal to happen too. Like, I do think it took a long time, but as people started to hear more and more promises from Nippon, I think that sort of turned the tide for how people at least were anecdotally talking about this. And that's the difference. Like, the Steelworkers Union has a much larger megaphone, but they may not have been tapped into what every one of their members wanted, full stop, you know?
Yeah. And I mean, there's no way we could know what every single union member wanted anyway. So you have the folks who showed up at the rally, you have the leadership, and I'm sure there were a lot of different feelings and opinions in between.
Yeah, but I think that's part of what makes this whole thing so interesting, but also like so widespread, right? Like, yes, it affects every single worker at these plants, but it also affects a huge portion of Pittsburgh, our environmental and economic portfolio, and also like foreign policy, which is like not a thing we talk about a whole lot on this show. For what it's worth, I do think that that mill worker had a teeny point, at least in that Japan is a U.S. ally, has been for a very long time. Like, in one of the ads that Nippon was running, they suggested that it is possible that some of the people who have been opposing the deal all of 2024 were maybe confusing Japan with China.
I mean, sure, but probably not government officials.
I mean, yes and no. Like, government officials have to respond to political realities to some extent. Like, there is a level of theater to some of this. And I hope that that is not what influenced it, but that is what critics are saying now. Mm-hmm. You know, actually, I was reading about a different deal just a few weeks ago, a different Japanese firm, the CEO of SoftBank. He's just like a big Trump guy. And he's promised now to invest $100 billion into AI. Like, there's no other details. Just wants to give America and American companies $100 billion. Very little specifics, just a promise for money and a whole lot of jobs. We'll see if it pans out, because people have promised Trump a lot of money in the past and some of those deals didn't work out. But like, that deal was fine. That one was cool. But this one is like getting so much more scrutiny. And I just have so many questions about why, as I know everyone does.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's worth flagging why that foreign investment piece is so important. We are the top recipient in the world for foreign money, and so it can go toward funding things like physical plants or facilities, transfer of technology or ideas, job creation, more. Our economy sort of requires other countries to find value here and invest in meaningful ways. And there is concern about what message Biden just sent to foreign companies looking to invest here by blocking this deal for reasons that, again, still seem vague.
Yeah. And I mean, to Japan specifically, because Japan is one of the, if not the number one country that gives us money, like direct foreign investment, and we are their top investor too. The Prime Minister of Japan has said publicly that he hoped that this would go through, that it's in the interest of both countries. He has since asked Washington to, quote, explain clearly what the national security risks were, like what was in play. And then, you know, I was really struck too by this recent episode of PBS NewsHour that was talking a lot about this. They had David Wessel with the Brookings Institution on. You know, they do a lot of research and talking about economic and foreign policy. But there was one part that I just thought was like really, really well summed up.
The president said that a domestically owned and operated steel industry is important to national security. But what Nippon Steel was saying is, we're still going to make it in the United States. The owners will just be Japanese, which last time I checked was an ally of the United States, not an adversary.
He went on to say, quote, we love it when Europeans come here and we're subsidizing another nation making computer chips. But, quote, if you can call the Japanese buying a steel mill a national security threat, you can call almost anything a national security threat, end quote, which, like, I don't know. I mean, he's a really smart person and he's talking about that and it makes me wonder.
Yeah. And, you know, Megan, you mentioned Japan's prime minister asked for a clear explanation about the national security risks that were in play with this. If he has gotten any answers yet, no one has told Pittsburgh, but it does seem like the U.S. and Japan are going to be in conversation. The U.S. Secretary of State got to Tokyo yesterday. I read that Nippon's holding a press conference today. We don't know the details about that timing yet. So it seems like some kind of conversation is forthcoming.
Yeah. And, there were so many statements that came out in the wake of this. The United Steelworkers, for example, they called Biden's decision bold action. And they said that they're confident with responsible management that U.S. Steel could continue to support good jobs, healthy communities, and robust national and economic security well into the future. But I guess my question is, could they? Perhaps. But will they is a different question. Because, again, U.S. Steel has been saying for years that they are neither interested nor wealthy enough to do all of that work on their own in perpetuity.
Yeah, I've also seen speculation of maybe Cleveland-Cliffs will come back with a new deal for U.S. Steel to consider.
Although their CEO said repeatedly that they're not going to do that. They're done.
Well, and also the fact that U.S. Steel is now suing them, I don't think necessarily creates, a positive relationship moving forward.
A healthy starting place for new negotiations. Yeah.
Right.
I would also just love for someone in the middle of all of this to explain to me whether American-made steel is even important anymore, on a grand scale. I understand the legacy. We're in the Empire State Building. U.S. Steel helped in the San Francisco Bay Bridge. That's great. But are we still a big player? I don't know. Because I've heard people talk about, for a long time now, Chinese-made steel. There are companies here in the Pittsburgh region that are owned by China, not U.S. Steel, not anything that big. But I just wonder, because our steelmaking process is very time-intensive and very old school. There are new models for it now, and it sounded like that is something that is at least absorbed as part of Nippon's portfolio, and that it might become part of U.S. Steel's as well. And I just don't know. I understand the U.S. Steel of it all, the legacy part, but is it actually economically important? I don't know the answer to that, and I don't see anyone reporting on it.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to some of those questions. Anyway, a bunch of local leaders weighed in on Biden's decision. We will post a link in our show notes to our website where we have collected a bunch of those statements so you can see what they have to say.
Yeah. Some of them, just say U.S. Steel better figure it out. They have to honor their workers. Some were much more critical of the Biden decision. You can read them for yourself. For what it's worth, a Trump administration may not be any more friendly than the Biden administration. Trump was also trying to court the United Steelworkers Union throughout his campaign. And he has also pledged all year long to block this deal, just like Biden did. So I don't know that it gets any friendlier here in a few weeks.
Yeah. So again, we've got excerpts from a bunch of these statements on our website if you'd like to read them for yourself. And we will keep you posted. As these lawsuits indicate, it sounds like Nippon and U.S. Steel have not given up all of their hope for now. So we will continue to follow the story.
That's all for today here on CityCast Pittsburgh. Reminder, you can find all of our shows, old and new, on our website. That is pittsburgh.citycast.fm. We will be back tomorrow with more news from around the city. Talk to you soon.
This shelf in my closet just fell. I should just give up. It always falls.